Well, if you'll take your Bibles and turn with me this morning to the Old Testament, we're going to look into the book of Job. Job. If you're new to the Bible, that's not Job. It is Job. I'm not sure how many of you keep up with the news. I don't know if you like watching the news or not. Confession, I don't make it a habit because it's so depressing for me. But every once in a while, I'll feel strong enough and I'll turn the news on and I'll watch things that are going on. And you see the world news and it's like another village attacked by terrorists and floods decimating cities and corrupt governments, ruining cultures, and then even in our own city, there's murder and sex trafficking, and I'm reminded, that's why I don't watch the news. This is depressing. Turn it off, and then I go several months without watching it again. But, really, you don't have to watch the news to come face to face with suffering and pain and trouble. Because trouble and pain hits closer to home a lot more often than we realize it or would like to admit it. Aging parents, wayward children, undiagnosed illnesses, broken relationships, stress in marriage, chronic pain, cancer, you name it, it hits us. And it's hit our church. And some of you are here this morning, and we will never know the extent of the suffering that you have gone through. I know for a fact that some of you this morning are suffering right now. Some of you are suffering in light of things that just happened this last week, and some within the last month. Some are reeling from things that have happened years ago. And honestly, any one of us could enter into suffering this coming week. Now, I'm not saying that to discourage us, but I just want to be real about it. Some people within the Christian world would try to portray suffering in the Christian life as something that we just don't talk about. Some would portray the Christian life as like this fantasy land of faith where following Jesus is happy times and sunshine and it's just wonderful all the time. But the Bible denies that. The Bible doesn't overlook the plain reality of suffering in our life. The Bible doesn't ignore the hard experiences that we will face. It addresses them head on, and it calls us actually to anticipate pain and suffering and trials. And the Bible establishes for us a way to find stability in the middle of instability. Now, here's my concern this morning is that often in the face of suffering is when some of the worst theology comes out of our mouths. And I get it, because in the middle of pain, sometimes you're just kind of grasping after something to hold on to. You're looking for some kind of explanation to make sense of it all, but all too often it's very unbiblical conclusions. And in the end, it provides really no help and no stability in the middle of our storms of life. And really, I think that this is why when trouble comes crashing in on people's lives, that a lot of people get swept away. In fact, I would say that one of the greatest challenges to the Christian faith, whether it's an unbeliever coming to faith in Christ or a professing believer throwing their hands up saying, I'm done with this, the greatest challenge to the Christian faith is this: our inability to understand the why of God's way. In fact, one famous agnostic put it this way. He said, I think that if God appeared to me and gave me an explanation that could make sense of all pain and suffering, and the explanation was so overpowering that I actually could understand, then I'd be the first to fall on my knees in humble submission and admiration. If God could really make sense of it all, then I'd be the first to submit to him. But his problem is this: God's not making sense of it to me. And here's the problem for many. The problem isn't that suffering exists. The problem is there doesn't appear to be any purpose in it. And for many, the God of the Bible and the presence of pain and suffering cannot be logically reconciled. The thinking goes like this. If there were a God, he could stop all the suffering. And if he were loving, he'd obviously want to stop all the suffering. But since there's still suffering in this world, obviously this all-powerful, all-loving God of the Bible cannot exist. Now let me just say, that struggle of faith is not foreign to the Christian. Those questions and those tensions and those struggles are not absent from those that follow Jesus. And the tension that a lot of us face in life is this: God, I know that you know all things. And God, I know that you can do all things. But God, do you know what you're doing? Now, I can say that because I've asked that question more times than I care to admit. I find myself questioning the ways of God a lot. God, I know you know, and I know that you can do, but do you really know what you're doing? I struggle asking at times if God is really good. I've found myself asking, is all this even real? You say, you're a pastor, you probably shouldn't say that. I'm just being honest with you. So what do you do when life doesn't make sense? Well, today we're going to look at the book of Job. Yes, we're going to look at the whole book of Job. My wife said last night, that's going to be a trial. But my prayer is this, that we would arm ourselves with biblical thinking. Now, that's not to say that biblical thinking makes suffering easy. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that really good theology will answer all the questions of life. That's not what I am saying. My prayer is that you will be ready when difficulty comes. My prayer is that you who are in the middle of suffering and trial and heartache right now, that you would find stability. My prayer is that each and every one of us would be equipped to actually help others that are going through suffering. So let's look to see the story of this guy, Job. Right away, we're introduced to this man, Job. Chapter 1, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He possessed 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and very many servants. So that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. His sons used to go and hold a feast in the house, each one on his day, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the days of the feast had run their course, Job would send and consecrate them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number for them all. For Job says, it may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Thus Job did continually. This is a pretty fascinating guy. But then in verse 6, the curtain on eternity is pulled back, and we get a glimpse into the heavenly realm. Now, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth and from walking up and down on it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? that there's none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. And Satan answered the Lord and said, does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. In other words, God, you've paid this guy to worship you. So stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. And the Lord said to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. And what happens next is unthinkable. Verse 13. Now there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and there came a messenger to Job and said, the oxen were plowing, the donkeys were feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans fell upon them and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 groups and made a raid on the camels and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people, and they are dead. And I alone have escaped to tell you. Wow. Now, as we begin looking at this story, I just want you to understand and notice something here. First of all, that suffering is going to be a normal part of life in a fallen world. Now, I want you to see that the story of the Bible reminds us this, that pain and suffering has not always been, and trial and difficulty will not always be. Suffering is just one chapter of the story of eternity, but it happens to be the chapter in which we're living right now. We live in a fallen world, and the Bible makes no attempts to hide that fact. So suffering is going to be a part of life in a fallen world, but sometimes it just feels like suffering is often undeserved. Now, the Bible does tell us that sometimes suffering is a result of sin. It's a result of our sin, the result of the sin of other people, and at times we suffer because of our own foolish choices. Sometimes we suffer because someone else has made a foolish choice. Sin will always bring about suffering to one degree or another. But in this story, Job's suffering was not because of sin, his or anyone else's. In fact, the author goes to really great lengths to show us that Job has integrity. He has great godliness. So suffering comes, but it feels like it's often very undeserved. Suffering is typically unexpected. You probably weren't planning your calendar this week thinking through, okay, suffering on Wednesday, pain, trials Thursday. You can't schedule it. In fact, did you see how nondescript the author was in this? Verse 13. Now there was a day. Just like out of the blue, everything turned upside down for Job. First his servants, then his possessions, his children, gone. You can't typically plan on that. Suffering is often unexpected, but suffering is always painful. If we kept reading into chapter 2, we would find that not only did the family and possessions of Job get hit, but actually Job himself gets hit, and it's pretty horrendous. In fact, the rest of the book would describe the trial that Job went through physically in light of skin sores, intense itching, loss of appetite, atrophy, boils, breathing difficulty, weight loss, chronic pain, and fever. And in his deepest nightmare, Job could not have imagined all this. And by chapter 2 and verse 8, you once had a guy who is greatly respected and he had it all. And now in an ancient expression of intense grief, he has shaved his head, he's ripped his clothes, and he's sitting in an ash heap. And in desperation to find some kind of relief, he's picked up some broken pottery shard and he's trying to scratch his sores. I mean, this guy is going through it. Now, I doubt there's anyone in here that has suffered to the extent that Job has, but that's not the point. The point's not who suffered more, who suffers worse. The point is this, that trials always will produce pain. Emotional pain, mental anguish, physical pain. Loss is heavy. Grief is hard. Physical pain carries with it physiological impacts. And let me just say, you can really love Jesus and have solid theology and still go through great pain. And at the end of chapter 2, we find a few friends coming to comfort Job, and how they do it is they sit in silence for a week, not saying a thing. That's wonderful. And at the end of this week, Job finally musters the strength to say something. What's been going on in his mind? Well, in great despair, he just pours his heart out. He pours out his grief. He expresses his confusion. I just say you don't have to try to explain your pain away. You don't have to make excuses for the struggle that you're facing. Church, you don't have to feel like you need to put on some spiritual happy face and pretend like everything's okay. God's not honored in that. God's honored in honest expressions of grief and pain. Job expressed his grief and worshiped. In all of this, he did not sin, but he was so confused. In a fallen world, suffering is normal. It often comes in an undeserved way. It's unexpected. It's always painful. But it's at this point in the story that everything kind of takes a turn. And from chapter 4 through chapter 37, Job agonizes while his three friends decide to talk and help him figure out why this has happened to Job. And as you read through this section of Job, you'll find that this is just a section of incredibly heavy Hebrew poetry, and it's not immediately easy to grasp. So I just want to kind of walk through it and help you see what's going on so you get a framework for thinking as you read through Job. But what we find in this section of Job is that human explanations for suffering always fall short. Human explanation for why suffering will always fall short. All right, so they open their mouths and they begin to talk. There's three guys, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. Great names if you're wanting to name your kids. Chapters 4 and 5, Eliphaz talks, and he says, Job, you know, when people are innocent, God doesn't punish them like this. He's a just God. In chapter 6 and 7, Job is like, seriously? That's all you got to say to me? I mean, I know I'm not perfect, but I'm not hiding any sin that's going to bring on this sort of affliction. In chapter 8, Bildad speaks up and says, Job, I'm going to beg with you to stop hardening yourself against God because he would never punish you like this if you were blameless. In chapters 9 and 10, Job responds to Bildad and says, listen, I know God is just, and I get that. He will punish sin. And then it's like Job starts trying to put the pieces together. And he starts to question God's ways. And he even starts to challenge God himself as to what God is doing, accusing God of maybe falling asleep at the wheel trying to run this universe. So in chapter 11, Zophar steps up to the mic, says, Job, you really deserve a lot worse. Whoa, thanks. And Zophar says, if you would just repent of your sin, you'll be done with this. In chapter 12, Job makes a very interesting statement. Job answered them and said, no doubt you are the people, and wisdom will die with you. Apparently you guys have got it all together, and when you die, this world will be empty of wisdom because you've got it. Thanks for sharing all your wisdom. For chapter 13 and verse 5, he says, oh, that you would keep silent. If you would just shut up, that would be wise, is what Job says here. In fact, one of my favorite things that Job says is in chapter 16 and verse 1. Job answered and said, I have heard many such things, miserable comforters. Well, this keeps going on. Job and his friends are, and they're talking, and his friends keep trying to make the same point. Job, you must have sinned in some pretty significant way to get this. Because God is just, and God is right, and God always judges sin. And you get the impression that for these three guys, there is no other explanation. And for the majority of Job, they're just feeding him lies about God. Similar lies that are being sold all around the world today in what we call the prosperity gospel. It says God will pour out his blessings on you if you will just live in faith. And suffering and sorrow are not a part of God's plan. I just say that is not gospel at all. It's heresy and it's dangerous and it's leading many people away from Christ. And here's Job. He's suffering, he's in pain, he's hurting, he's grieving, he's under the emotional weight of his friends saying all this to him. And it's not making any sense. You ever been there? God, I know that you can do all things. And God, I know that you know all things. But God, with everything that you know and all that you can do you know what you're doing? And he wrestles. And he tries to put his hope in God, but there's so many unanswered questions. And as you start to see Job wrestle with this in his mind, he actually slips into start accusing God of neglect. He's accusing God of incompetence. He accuses God of running the universe with injustice. And in Job chapter 31, he calls out for a meeting with God. It's like he comes to the point where he's like, God, you've got some explaining to do. Things aren't adding up here. Why? What's going on? And then out of the blue, in chapter 32, this guy named Elihu shows up and he says, I've been listening to this whole thing, and can I just respectfully say, Job, to your friends, you guys are really unhelpful. But he turns to Job and he says, Job, you need to be very careful of accusing God like that. And Elihu says, God's majestic. And God is great. And the majesty and the greatness of God's power is immeasurably greater than any of ours. And he's talking, and it's like as he finishes his monologue, at the end of chapter 37, God shows up. And it's almost as the words are still in the air as Elihu is speaking, God shows up to respond to Job. And he wants to respond to Job's accusations. But instead of answering why and defending himself, God actually gives Job a two-part quiz. And this quiz has about 65 to 70 questions on it. And it's everything from astronomy to meteorology to zoology to the ecosystems to law and order and justice. Pretty hefty quiz. And what we're going to come and learn in these final chapters of the book of Job is not only that God's power is immeasurably greater than yours, but the reality is that the greatness of God's wisdom is beyond our comprehension. So if the measure of God's wisdom is as high above us as his power is, then we're not dealing with just a slightly bigger, slightly smarter version than us. Look at Job 38 as God begins to unfold this quiz. And let's just see a few things that he unfolds for Job by way of question. Job 38, and look at verse 4. First question, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? Or what were its bases sunk in? Or who laid its cornerstone? Job, did you take the measurements? Did you level up this universe thing? Did you set the forms and pour the foundation? Were you there? Verse 12. Have you commanded the morning since your days began and caused the dawn to know its place? Job, did you tell the sun to kind of bring morning today? A few weeks ago, I woke up fairly early in the morning. Earlier than normal people would. And I tried to make coffee. And I'm trying to be quiet because I don't want to wake everyone up. And so I'm grinding beans and I spill it everywhere. I was like, this is pathetic. One of my friends used to say, when you're trying to make coffee, God's making morning. I can barely grind beans, much less tell the sun that, hey, time to bring morning on. Verse 16. Have you entered into the springs of the sea or walked in the recesses of the deep? Hey, Job, how far down into the oceans and the seas have you been? I think it's fascinating in our modern world, as much as we have explored of just our solar system, we haven't even comprehended the depths of the Marianas Trench. We're like 7 miles down. God knows the intricate details of the depths of the ocean that humanity will probably never even see. Verse 18, have you comprehended the expanse of the earth? Declare, if you know all this. Job, do you know how all this is working? And he goes on, and through the rest of this next couple of chapters, he's asking questions like, Job, are you the one that brings food out for the lions? You know those goats that are isolated up on the mountain cliffs and they're giving birth? You the one helping them with that? You understand the feeding patterns of wild donkeys? Hey, have you ever noticed the habits of ostriches with their young? Why are they doing that, Job? Can you explain to me the aerodynamics of an eagle flying? And what he's unfolding is that there is a supernatural wisdom behind the mysterious intricacies of the created order. Job, if you can't understand the mysteries of the natural world, can you expect to understand the mysteries of eternity? The mystery of Job's suffering was connected to millions of other mysteries in the universe. Mysteries that God alone understands, mysteries that God alone orders and directs and sustains. And the reality is that God's perspective on the universe has infinitely wider range than our minds could ever fathom. And our evaluation on God and how he runs his universe is so limited. We just don't have a vantage point wide enough to accuse God of incompetence or neglect. And so, since we're not capable of processing the information that's necessary to run a universe on the macro or micro level, is it possible? Is it possible that there are things that will not make sense to us? Is it possible that God is not only all-powerful and not only good and all-knowing, is it possible that in his infinite wisdom, he has purposes that we will never grasp with our finite, limited perspective? Well, Job responds in chapter 40, in verse 3. Job answered the Lord and says, "Behold, I am of small account." It's an understatement. What shall I answer you? I don't know what to say. But God says, hold on. That's just part one. There's more to the quiz. And now he begins to talk about law and order and justice in the created world. Chapter 40 and verse 8, he says, "Will you even put me in the wrong? Will you condemn me that you may be in the right? Have you an arm like God, and can you thunder with a voice like his? Adorn yourself with majesty and dignity. Clothe yourself with glory and splendor. Pour out the overflowings of your anger, and look on everyone who is proud and abase him. Look on everyone who is proud and bring him low, and tread down the wicked where they stand." Job, would you be interested in running the universe for a day? But if you do, I want you to use the principle of strict justice that you think I should be using. The standard of justice and fairness that you are thinking. Because Job, if you were going to reward every good deed and punish every bad one, it would create a universe where there's no room for trial and error. There's no room for growth and maturity. There's no room for mercy and grace. Job, if you want to run the universe on your strict idea of justice and fairness, you're going to end up with a planet that has no more humans or animals. And Job is starting to realize that with all the complexity and the wonder and the diversity and the mystery and even the danger, God alone has the power and the authority over it all. He alone has wisdom to run it all in a way that you and I could never, ever imagine. Oh, the depths of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his ways, are his judgments and his ways past finding out. And here it is. For 3 chapters, God is asking Job these basic questions. Job, were you there? Do you know? Can you do? And Job all along is having to say, I was not there. I do not know. I cannot do. And so God in his kindness says, Job, if you weren't there, and if you don't know, and you cannot do, you don't have the perspective required to call a foul. Here's the reality, that there is a point where our understanding stops, and then there is an infinite gap to where the ways of God are. Between my understanding and the wisdom and the ways of God, there is an infinite gap. And listen, when you go through trials and suffering in life, you're going to fill that gap with something. You're going to either fill that gap with fear, anger, despair, cynicism, bitterness, rejection. You're going to fill the gap with something. And the story of Job teaches us this, that when there's a gap between the ways of God and our understanding, and there will always be a gap, we must fill the gap with trust. When there's a gap between the ways of God and our understanding, we must fill the gap with trust. And Job says, God, tell me what's going on. God says, Job, I know exactly what's going on. But your perspective is too limited for you to even comprehend what's going on. So when there's a gap between the ways of God and your understanding, you must fill that gap with trust. And in the midst of our circumstances, we must come to realize that God alone is perfect. His way is perfect. He always will do what is right and good, even when to us it's not apparently right or good. So the lesson of Job is this: since you were not there, and since you do not know, and since you cannot do, you must trust the one who was there, who does know, and who can do. We need to realize what God reveals to us in the book of Job is that suffering on earth will only be understood from the perspective of heaven. Now, here's the thing about it is we have heaven's perspective on the story of Job. We get to see in behind the curtain, so to speak, and we know what was going on. We know that Job was blameless and that he feared the Lord. We know that Satan was accusing God of paying Job off. But at no point was Job ever brought in on the conversation. The only perspective Job had was the darkness of his trial. And the reality is that we walk through pain and suffering, and we're just like Job. We have a limited perspective. Now, let me just say, just in case you're wondering, this doesn't mean that anytime we suffer, God just had a conversation with Satan about us. I'm not saying that. But just because we cannot know what God is doing, it doesn't mean God doesn't know what he's doing. Now, I say that because that's the struggle. God, do you know what you're doing? And as Job begins to see more and more of the greatness and the wisdom of God in chapters 38 through 41, he realizes that, here's what he realizes: I've been asking the wrong question. I've been asking why. The question needs to be, who? Job 42, verse 1. Then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me which I did not know. Here I will speak, I will question you and make it known to me. I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes see you. Do you see the change? He's not asking why, he's asking who. God, I need to see more of who you are. And this is the lesson of Job. Biblical trust does not come in understanding the reasons. Biblical trust comes in the revelation of God himself. In other words, our trust in God can never be based on knowing why. It must be based on knowing who. Now, you might be satisfied with the story of Job because you know the whole story. Maybe not. Maybe it causes a lot more questions in your mind. But I want you to understand that Job's satisfaction at the end here isn't because he got the whole story. His satisfaction is because he got a glimpse of who God is. I hear people say a lot of times, and I've said it myself, when I die, one of the first things I'm going to do is I'm going to ask God why this and why that and why this. Anybody here with me? Am I the only one that's ever asked that? Okay. As I think about that and I read through the story of Job, I start to go, I don't think that's going to happen. Because I think when we see God, we're going to be so overwhelmed with who God is that any of our why questions will be so much a remnant of our existence in a fallen world. They'll just kind of fade away in the reality of his presence. And in eternity, who will completely overwhelm our why. And what Job is a reminder to me is that my greatest need in the middle of suffering is not an explanation from God. I need a revelation of God himself. Now, some of you are saying, no, I think I'd rather have the explanation. Maybe I could illustrate it this way. If I've learned anything over my 22 years of marriage, and that's not a whole lot, but I have learned that when my wife is hurting and having a rough day, what she needs from me is not an explanation. In fact, that's the last thing she wants. Trust me. She just wants my love and my support and just my presence there. Does that make sense? And I think that's what God's revealing to Job here. Is Job, you don't really want an explanation. You need me. You need to know who I am. And you need to know my presence. And this is the wonder. This is the wonder of the Bible. That we have a God who is not distant from our pain and suffering, who's sitting up in the heavens kind of just giving you a bunch of philosophical explanations as to why suffering exists. That's not the God of the Bible. No, our God doesn't distance himself from this world of pain. He actually entered into it himself. He took on flesh. He was made in the likeness of men. And Hebrews tells us that Jesus, God in the flesh, was made like us in every respect. And since he himself has suffered, he's able to help those who are suffering. You see, in Jesus, we don't have a high priest who's unable to sympathize, that's sitting up there in the heavens just kind of distant. No. We have a high priest who sympathizes with us in our weaknesses because he came like us, and now in every respect he was tempted like us, but he was without sin. And the cross shows us what our suffering can't mean. What your suffering cannot mean is that God is absent or he doesn't know. Because at the cross, God entered into our suffering. He took the pain of life in a fallen world. He took the curse of sin on himself. And at a time that everything looked completely out of control, behind the scenes, God was in control just as much as he had ever been in control. And he takes the worst of human atrocities and he turns it around for his eternal glory and for the salvation of anyone who would believe on him. And the cross reveals to us that God works all things according to the counsel of his will. And so when you are confused, when you are doubting, when you are hurting and you're questioning God, be very careful that you do not view God through the lens of your circumstances. Always view your circumstances through the lens of the cross. And 3 days later, Jesus resurrected from the grave, defeating sin, death, and hell, and guaranteeing you and me that one day he will return. One day God will make all things new. And he will wipe away every tear from our eye. And death will be no more, neither shall there be mourning or crying or pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. This is our hope. I don't know if any of you are Lord of the Rings fans. Samwise Gamgee said, every sad thing will come untrue. There will be a day when every sad thing will come untrue. Now, real quick, I want you to turn back to the heart of the book in Job 19, and I want you to see something really special, because in the midst of despair, in the midst of his questioning, in the midst of him accusing God, trying to make sense of what he would never be able to comprehend, something in his mind and in his heart is drawn to what he did know. Job did know something, and in this he found a glimmer of hope. Job 19, verse 23. He says, oh, that my words were written. Oh, that they were inscribed in a book. Oh, that with an iron pen and lead they were engraved in the rock forever. For I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been thus destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself, and my eyes shall behold, and not another. I don't have all the answers, Job says, but I know that there is something that I can hope in. I have hope in the fact that this is not the end of all things. And Job, somehow or another, knew that there is a Redeemer. And one day he would see him with his own eyes. Listen, we know who that Redeemer is. And no matter how hard and how difficult and how dark times get, know this: you have a Redeemer who lives, and his name is Jesus. And in the end, he will stand on the earth, and all who trust him will see his face. So learn to anchor your life in the God who made this world, and in his surpassing greatness of his wisdom, he sustains it all, he orders it all in absolute perfection. And so when there's a gap between the wisdom and the ways of God and your understanding, fill that gap with trust. Keep your eyes fixed on him. Fight for faith. Fight for hope. Trust in him when nothing else makes sense. There's a song that we used to sing when I was growing up, and it said this: God is too wise to be mistaken. God is too good to be unkind. So when you don't understand, when you don't see his plan, when you can't trace his hand, trust his heart. We cannot understand all of his ways, but we can know him because of Jesus. And it's through knowing him that we can come to trust him and find stability in the middle of confusion. Do you know this God? Do you trust him? I don't know where you are this morning. I do know that there is a lot of pain and suffering in our church right now. And the question's not who is going through it worse. We're all going through it to some level or another. Pastor Josh and I were talking this morning about just spending some time in prayer for one another right now. And what I want to do is come together as a church around those who are suffering right now. Many of you, if you just paused and you just looked around right now, you could probably identify somebody who's going through a trial right now. In fact, go ahead, do that. You could just look around. Just identify somebody that's going through a trial right now. And I want you to just see one or two people that you know are going through it. And here's what I'm going to ask us to do this morning. If you know that somebody here is going through a trial and they're right here near you, I'm going to ask you in just a few minutes, I want you to go to that person and I want you to pray for them and pray with them. And here's something else that I want to do. And I don't want to do this to make any of us feel uncomfortable here. But if you are here this morning and you are suffering, you're going through a trial, whatever the level is, and you want someone to pray for you, I'm going to invite you to invite people to pray for you. You can stand up and say, will somebody pray for me? You can just sit there and raise your hand if you want to. It's okay. This is what a church family does, right? We're honest and open with each other, and we support each other in prayer. So if you want someone to pray for you, I invite you, you could just stand up or raise your hand. And if you don't know anybody and you see somebody that's standing and raise their hand, you go and I want you to pray with them. All right, and just there's no order, rhyme, or reason to this. Just pray. Pray to God for that individual this morning. So can we just do this as we close this morning? Let's just take a few minutes together, and I want you to find somebody near you, and I want you to go and pray for them. Just pray out loud and lift our prayers to God this morning on behalf of one another. If you don't know anyone and you're uncomfortable moving around, you're welcome to just stay in your seat and pray quietly there. But if you want someone to pray for you, if you know somebody, let's move toward one another, and let's support each other in prayer this morning, that we would trust our all-wise God. Let's pray together.